On the morning of December 7, 1941, a 56-year-old American admiral was sitting at home in Washington, D.C., when the telephone began to ring. He was the chief of the United States Navy's Bureau of Navigation, the office responsible for personnel, which was, in the pre-war Navy, one of the most important administrative posts an officer could hold. He had spent most of his career on submarines, on cruisers, and behind desks. He had never commanded a fleet in action. He had never fought a major battle. He was known within the service as a competent, quiet, methodical officer of Texas German extraction who did not raise his voice, did not lose his temper, and did not seek the spotlight. He was, by every measure of public visibility in the United States Navy of 1941, an obscure man. 10 days later, President Franklin D. Roosevelt would name him Commander-in-Chief of the United States Pacific Fleet, the man who would, from that moment forward, be personally responsible for fighting and winning the war against the Empire of Japan across the largest theater of operations in the history of human warfare. He took command of a fleet that was still burning at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. 4 years later, he would sign the instrument of Japanese surrender on the deck of the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay, alongside General Douglas MacArthur, as the representative of the United States of America. His name was Chester William Nimitz. This is his story. Chester Nimitz was born on February 24, 1885, in Fredericksburg, Texas, a small town in the hill country west of Austin, settled in the previous century by German immigrants who had brought their language, their food, and their traditions with them to the Texas frontier. His father had died several months before he was born. He was raised by his mother and his paternal grandfather, Charles Nimitz, a former sea captain in the German merchant marine who had emigrated to Texas as a young man and built a hotel in Fredericksburg that still stands today. The grandfather is important to the story. Charles Nimitz, in the way that grandfathers sometimes do, took the fatherless boy in hand and taught him things. He taught him about the sea. He taught him about ships. He taught him in particular a piece of practical philosophy that the boy would carry for the rest of his life, that the sea did not care about a man's plans, that storms came whether one was ready for them or not, and that the only thing to do was to do one's duty calmly, do it well, and not waste energy on what could not be controlled. It was a lesson that would, in the fullness of time, prove useful. Young Chester originally wanted to attend the United States Military Academy at West Point and become an Army officer. There were no appointments available. There was, however, an appointment available to the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis. He took it. He graduated in 1905, 7th in a class of 114. He was 20 years old, and he was going to sea. Nimitz's early career was, by any reasonable definition, almost a disaster. His first major command, at the age of 22, was the destroyer USS Decatur, operating in the Philippines. In July of 1908, sailing into the harbor of Batangas at night, in waters he had not properly charted, Nimitz ran the Decatur firmly aground on a mud bank. The ship was eventually pulled off. No one was killed. But running a United States Navy warship aground was, then as now, a serious matter. Nimitz was court-martialed. He was found guilty of neglect of duty. He was issued a letter of reprimand. It was the kind of incident that ended careers. Many young officers with a court-martial conviction on their record never recovered. Nimitz, by all accounts, simply accepted the punishment, learned the lesson, and went back to work. The Navy, evidently, decided that one mudbank was not the measure of the man. He was assigned to submarines, at that time a new and somewhat disreputable branch of the service, considered by traditional surface officers to be a poor career choice. Nimitz threw himself into it. He became one of the Navy's leading experts on submarines and on the diesel engines that powered them. He went to Germany and to Belgium before the First World War to study diesel technology. He helped design the engines for some of the Navy's early submarines. He commanded submarines, commanded submarine flotillas, and helped to shape the doctrine of underwater warfare in the United States Navy. Through the years between the wars, he moved steadily upward. He served on staffs. He commanded ships. He studied at the Naval War College. He developed, in particular, an interest in the concept of circular task force formations, the idea of organizing a fleet not in the traditional line-ahead column, but in concentric rings around a center, with the most valuable ships, the carriers, in the middle, and the screening vessels arrayed defensively around them. It was a tactical concept that would, when the time came, prove decisive. By 1939, Nimitz was a rear admiral. By 1941, he was chief of the Bureau of Navigation. And on December 7, 1941, the telephone began to ring. The attack on Pearl Harbor destroyed or severely damaged 8 American battleships, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and a number of auxiliary vessels. More than 2,400 American servicemen were killed. The man in command of the Pacific Fleet at the time of the attack, Admiral Husband Kimmel, was relieved within days. President Roosevelt and the Secretary of the Navy needed a new commander, and they needed him quickly. They chose Nimitz. It was not an obvious choice. There were more senior admirals. There were admirals with more sea command experience. There were admirals with louder reputations. Roosevelt chose Nimitz, by accounts of those involved, precisely because of the qualities that had kept him obscure: his steadiness, his competence, his ability to work with difficult subordinates, his refusal to panic or to dramatize. Nimitz flew to Hawaii in late December of 1941. He arrived on Christmas Day. The harbor was still a mess of oil and wreckage. The bodies of American sailors were still being recovered from the hulls of the sunken battleships. The mood among the surviving officers, by every account that has come down to us, was somewhere between numbness and despair. He took command of the Pacific Fleet on December 31, 1941, in a ceremony held on the deck of a submarine, because no surface ship of appropriate stature was available, in Pearl Harbor. He made, in those first days, 2 decisions that would shape everything that followed. The first was that he would keep most of the staff officers he had inherited from Admiral Kimmel. They had been blamed in many quarters for the disaster of December 7th. Nimitz looked at them, listened to them, and concluded that they were good officers who had been caught by a surprise attack that no one in the American government had truly believed would happen. He told them, in effect, that he was not interested in finding scapegoats. He was interested in winning the war. They would stay. The second decision was about tone. Nimitz refused from the very first day to allow defeatism in his headquarters. He did not minimize what had happened. He did not pretend that the situation was anything other than terrible. But he projected, in every meeting and every conversation and every order, a quiet certainty that the war could be won, would be won, and that the work of winning it would begin immediately. It was the lesson his grandfather had taught him 60 years earlier in the Texas Hill Country. The storm had come. The only thing to do was the work. The first 6 months of 1942 were the darkest period of the war in the Pacific. Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and the Central Pacific in a series of campaigns that, in speed and scope, had no real precedent. Singapore fell, the Philippines fell, the Dutch East Indies fell, Wake Island fell, Guam fell. By the spring of 1942, Japan controlled an empire that stretched from the borders of India to the Central Pacific and from the Aleutian Islands to the approaches to Australia. Nimitz, with a fleet that had lost its battleship line at Pearl Harbor, had only one major asset left: his aircraft carriers, which had been at sea on the day of the attack and had therefore survived. He used them carefully. In May of 1942, American carriers intercepted a Japanese invasion force headed for Port Moresby in New Guinea. The resulting Battle of the Coral Sea was the first naval battle in history fought entirely between aircraft launched from carriers. Neither side's surface ships ever saw the other. The Americans lost the carrier Lexington. The Japanese lost a light carrier and had 2 fleet carriers damaged. The invasion was turned back. It was, tactically, something close to a draw. Strategically, it was the first time in the war that a Japanese offensive had been stopped. A month later came the battle that would change everything. Japanese intelligence had decided to lure the remaining American carriers into a decisive battle near the island of Midway, at the far western end of the Hawaiian chain. American codebreakers, working under conditions of extreme secrecy in a basement at Pearl Harbor, had broken enough of the Japanese naval code to know that the attack was coming, where it was coming, and roughly when. Nimitz made the decision to fight. He had 3 carriers, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, which had been damaged at Coral Sea and which the Navy Yard at Pearl Harbor put back into fighting condition in 72 hours, in a feat of repair work that has become legendary. The Japanese had 4 fleet carriers, all veterans of Pearl Harbor, under the command of Admiral Nagumo. The Battle of Midway was fought between June 4th and 7th, 1942. In the space of a few minutes on the morning of June 4th, American dive bombers from the Enterprise and the Yorktown caught the Japanese carriers in the act of refueling and rearming their aircraft, with fuel lines on the decks and bombs stacked in the hangars. 3 Japanese carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu, were turned into burning wrecks within minutes. The 4th, the Hiryu, launched a counterstrike that mortally wounded the Yorktown and was then found and destroyed by American dive bombers later in the day. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and, most irreplaceable of all, hundreds of its most experienced pilots and aircrew. It was a blow from which the Japanese naval air arm would never fully recover. Nimitz had been in command of the Pacific Fleet for just over 5 months. The tide of the war in the Pacific had turned. What followed Midway was not a quick victory, but a long, grinding, island-by-island advance across the largest ocean in the world. Nimitz commanded it from a headquarters that grew, over the course of the war, from a small office at Pearl Harbor into a vast organization directing the movements of thousands of ships, millions of men, and the largest naval war in human history. He worked, by every account, calmly. He arrived at his office at a regular hour. He left at a regular hour. He walked regularly with his dogs. He held morning staff meetings that were brisk, businesslike, and short. He insisted on hearing dissenting opinions and on allowing his subordinates to argue with him. He had difficult subordinates. Admiral William F. Bull Halsey, aggressive, profane, beloved by his sailors, given to dramatic public statements, was one of Nimitz's principal fleet commanders. Admiral Raymond Spruance, quiet, intellectual, cold-blooded under pressure, was another. Admiral Ernest J. King, the chief of naval operations in Washington, was Nimitz's superior and was famously one of the most difficult men in the United States Navy, an officer whom President Roosevelt once described as a man who shaved with a blowtorch. Nimitz managed all of them. He managed also an even harder relationship with General Douglas MacArthur, who commanded American forces in the Southwest Pacific Theater, and who was, by temperament, almost everything Nimitz was not. MacArthur was theatrical, ambitious, jealous of his prerogatives, and convinced that his theater should have priority. Nimitz was none of those things. The 2 men disagreed repeatedly about strategy, about whether the main American advance should go through the Philippines, as MacArthur wanted, or directly across the Central Pacific, as Nimitz preferred. The disputes went up to the president himself. In the end, both campaigns went forward, In parallel, in one of the largest exercises of compromise in the history of American military strategy. The campaigns themselves became the great names of the Pacific War. Guadalcanal, in the Solomon Islands, where the United States Marine Corps fought its first major land campaign of the war, and where the United States Navy lost so many ships in the surrounding waters that the channel north of the island was nicknamed Iron Bottom Sound. Tarawa, in the Gilbert Islands, where the cost of amphibious assault against a heavily fortified atoll was learned in blood. The Marshall Islands, the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, Guam. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, in which American carriers under Spruance, operating exactly along the lines Nimitz had been working out for 30 years, destroyed what was left of Japanese naval air power in a single day. The American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Leyte Gulf, in October of 1944, the largest naval battle in history, in which the Imperial Japanese Navy was destroyed as an effective fighting force. Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each of these names is a story in itself, and each of these stories was being directed in its broadest outlines from the headquarters where the quiet admiral arrived at his regular hour and left at his regular hour and walked his dogs. By the summer of 1945, Japan had been driven back to its home islands. The Imperial Navy had effectively ceased to exist. American submarines, the descendants of the small, unreliable boats Nimitz had commanded as a young officer, had strangled Japanese commerce. American bombers were destroying Japanese cities. American forces were preparing for an invasion of Japan itself that, by every projection, would cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and millions of Japanese. The invasion never came. In August of 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan. The Japanese government, after agonized internal deliberations and an attempted military coup, accepted the Allied demand for unconditional surrender. On September 2, 1945, in Tokyo Bay, the formal surrender ceremony was held on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri. General Douglas MacArthur, as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, accepted the surrender on behalf of all the Allied nations. Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz signed the instrument of surrender on behalf of the United States of America. He had been promoted, the previous December, to the newly created rank of Fleet Admiral, the highest rank in the United States Navy, equivalent to the Army's General of the Army, held in the history of the United States Navy by only 4 men. He was, on the day of the surrender, 60 years old. He had been in command of the Pacific Fleet for 3 years and 8 months. He said very little at the ceremony. He signed the document. He stepped back. He let MacArthur speak. It was, in its way, characteristic. Nimitz returned to the United States as one of the most respected military officers in the country. He served from late 1945 until the end of 1947 as Chief of Naval Operations, the senior uniformed officer of the United States Navy, the same post that Admiral King had held during the war. It was, by accounts of those who served under him, a job that he did not particularly enjoy. The post-war period was a difficult one for the United States Navy. The military was being demobilized at enormous speed. The new Department of Defense was being created, with bitter inter-service fights over budgets and missions and the role of strategic air power in the atomic age. Nimitz, who had spent his career working quietly with difficult colleagues, did the work, navigated the bureaucratic battles, helped to shape the post his. Publishers offered him money. Historians begged him. He refused. He gave, when pressed, 2 reasons. The first was that he did not want to write a book that would inevitably involve criticizing officers who had served under him in the war. The second was that he did not believe that any one man's account of a war so large could ever be the whole truth. And he did not want to mistake his own perspective for the history. He lived quietly in retirement. He served briefly as a special assistant to the United Nations Secretary General. He served as a regent of the University of California. He walked his dogs. In his last years, he and Mrs. Nimitz lived on Yerba Buena Island in San Francisco Bay in a quarters provided by the Navy. He could look out his window and see, on any clear day, the ships of the United States Pacific Fleet, the fleet he had once commanded, moving in and out of the Golden Gate. Chester William Nimitz died on February 20th, 1966, 4 days before his 81st birthday. He had asked in his will to be buried not at Arlington National Cemetery, where his rank entitled him to a place, but at the Golden Gate National Cemetery in California, alongside his wartime subordinates Raymond Spruance, Richmond Kelly Turner, and Charles Lockwood, the commander of his submarine force. He wanted to lie with the men he had served with. The 4 graves are arranged in a small group, marked with identical headstones. It is, if one knows what to look for, one of the more moving small monuments in American military history. He grew up in a Texas Hill country town with a grandfather who taught him that the storm comes whether one is ready or not, and that the only thing to do is the work. He ran his first warship aground at 22 and learned not to do it again. He spent 30 years on submarines and behind desks, becoming an expert on diesel engines and circular task force formations and the management of difficult colleagues, while officers more glamorous than he was filled the newspapers. He was called in, on 10 days' notice, to take command of a fleet that was still burning at the bottom of a harbor, and he was told to win a war across an ocean. He won it. He signed the surrender. He went home, did not write a book, walked his dogs, and asked to be buried alongside the men he had served with. His name was Chester William Nimitz. He was, in the judgment of nearly every serious historian of the Pacific War, one of the greatest naval commanders the United States has ever produced, and almost certainly the quietest. The storm came. He did the work. If you enjoy true stories of American heroes, hit subscribe button so you don't miss the next one.